Like most single-room schoolhouses, Sandy Pond was a small neighborhood school. Average attendance was fewer than 25 students per year. Enrollment prior to its closing in 1906 was 18 students. Its students did not arrive in big yellow buses, nor did they have a school cafeteria. They made their way to school on foot and brought their own lunches in a basket, a tin pail, or wrapped in cloth. During the winter months, students would bring in firewood for the wood stove. In the 1800s, anyone who knew a little bit about math, history, reading, and writing could teach school. Teachers with an 8th grade education sometimes taught students a few years younger than themselves. Prior to the Civil War, most teachers were male. By the time Sandy Pond School opened in 1869, this had changed. All of the 27 Sandy Pond school teachers were women. For today's visitors, entering Sandy Pond Schoolhouse is a step back in time. Amazingly preserved is a typical comment, but students and teachers entering the new building when it first opened its doors would have had a different perspective. To them, it was quite modern. For one thing, unlike its wooden predecessors, it was a brick building. It was also noticeably larger, and the interior featured rows of wooden seats, replacing the hard plank desks and benches of previous years. Long benches around the perimeter of the room provided additional workspace for students. Windows were at a height that allowed airflow across the classroom. A centrally located stove that could evenly heat the room replaced the open fireplaces of earlier years. And to promote modesty, there were separate entrances for girls and boys. That said, single-room schools like Sandy Pond were sparsely equipped by today's standards. Books were expensive, and students often had to share them or do without. Because paper was also costly, students wrote their work out on slates using chalk, which they erased when done. When practicing penmanship, they often used a sharpened quill dipped in ink. The school day began with a ringing of the bell by a student selected by the teacher. The teacher would then greet the students, who would stand to recite the Lord's Prayer and salute the American flag. After this, the teacher handed out assignments to the older students and began working with the younger ones. The core subjects in the curriculum were the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Science and social studies were seldom offered. At schools fortunate enough to own a globe, however, geography was sometimes taught. Reading instruction began with a small book known as a primer. Primers covered basic reading skills, beginning with the alphabet. Letters were introduced one at a time. An illustration of the letter B, for example, might be accompanied by, "Thy life to mend, this book attend." After primers, students moved on to readers, which were divided into lessons. Each lesson introduced a few new words and typically consisted of a poem or short story. Elocution, or public speaking, was considered especially important, and students were often asked to memorize and recite poems in class. In an age before personal computers, word processing, or typewriters, good handwriting was an essential skill. The standard for good handwriting in the 19th century was Spencerian script. Mastery required a lot of practice. Students began by drawing evenly spaced horizontal lines on their slate or in a copybook, followed by lengthy practice sessions. Teachers monitored students' work carefully and sometimes required them to repeat each exercise until there was evidence of progress. Arithmetic was another important subject in the single-room schoolhouse. Up to 1/2 of the school day could be spent on it. Students were expected to memorize their math facts, and much time was spent on drills. Teachers would often write problems on the blackboard for students to copy and solve. The students were sometimes asked to raise their slates above their heads upon finishing a problem so the teacher could check their work while the other students continued with the assignment. As the population grew and separation into primary, intermediate, and high schools became the standard, Sandy Pond students were reassigned to the newer downtown schools, like the one on East Main Street. Meanwhile, the Ayer School Committee, on numerous occasions, recommended closing Sandy Pond School and transporting students downtown by way of the nearby Willows Junction railroad stop. Parents of younger students, however, strongly objected, as the train's limited schedule would mean an exceptionally long day for their children. This impasse was resolved in 1906 when the Lowell and Fitchburg Street Railway constructed a trolley line from North Chelmsford to downtown Ayer along Sandy Pond Road. The arrival of the trolley, with its more flexible schedule, provided the school committee with a solution. Accordingly, Sandy Pond School was closed, and its students began riding the trolley to downtown, marking the end of the single-room school era in Ayer. It was initially unclear what would become of Sandy Pond Schoolhouse after its closing. Faced with the prospect of spending additional money on maintenance, the town decided to sell the building in 1908. This led a group of local residents to plan and hold one last reunion at the school on June 27th. Everyone had such a good time that it was decided to form an association and raise money to buy the schoolhouse. And so it was that on December 22, 1908, the Town of Ayer sold Sandy Pond School to the trustees of the newly formed Sandy Pond School Association for the sum of $1. The original board of trustees consisted of 5 local residents, all of whom had been students at the school. The new association wasted little time making use of the building. The third annual reunion in June 1910 attracted 100 people. By this time, plans for improving the building were afoot. A fund was established to cover costs with donations limited to $1 per person. By late summer 1912, the classroom had been repainted, and the kitchen, a platform for a piano, and a new tongue-and-groove birch and pine floor were in place. A local newspaper reported, "The new birch floor was a splendid improvement to the room. The old platforms have been removed, making more floor space. The walls, with a restful pale green tint and the freshly whitened ceiling, make the room attractive and cozy." These improvements made the building suitable for social events without substantially altering the interior of the classroom. And so began Sandy Pond Schoolhouse's second chapter, during which it became a venue for reunions and a variety of public events. Among these were art shows, open houses, lectures, concerts, and dinner dances. As a result, Sandy Pond Schoolhouse became an integral fixture of local community life, an iconic landmark familiar to and beloved by many Ayer residents. Over time, however, reunion attendance fell, as many of the original students moved away, passed on, or, like the schoolhouse itself, grew older. With fewer members to carry on the association's work, open houses were held less frequently, and building maintenance became an increasing challenge. As a result, the mission of the association slowly evolved into one of continuing to maintain the building while preserving and publicizing its role in Ayer history. By the second decade of the 21st century, Sandy Pond Schoolhouse was approaching its 150th anniversary and showing its age. At first glance, its exterior appearance seemed little changed. A close inspection, however, revealed signs of much-needed repairs: damaged brickwork, peeling shutters, missing mortar, and most noticeably a sagging classroom ceiling that was in danger of imminent failure. Accordingly, in 2014, the association began a concerted effort to restore Sandy Pond Schoolhouse. The first step was a multi-year effort to place it on the National Register of Historic Places. This required both outside financial support and the hiring of a consultant. The needed funds were provided by the Town of Ayer, while Stacy Spies, a historic preservation consultant, brought the necessary expertise. In late 2016, the Massachusetts Historical Commission approved Stacy's final draft of the National Register nomination. Listing on the National Register followed shortly thereafter. Today, the handsome National Register plaque mounted on the front of the schoolhouse testifies to the success of Stacy's efforts and the town's generous support. Next came the physical restoration of the schoolhouse. As with the National Register, this proved to be a multi-year project requiring outside financial support and professional assistance. Once again, the financial support was provided by the Town of Ayer, in this case by the Community Preservation Committee. The much-needed expertise was supplied by Lynn Spencer and Doug Manley, formerly of Spencer, Sullivan and Vogt, and currently principals with Spencer Preservation Group. A full account of the restoration is a story in itself. It can, however, be broken down into 3 basic steps. First came a conditions assessment, whose preparation was overseen by Lynn Spencer and Doug Manley. Delivered in 2017, that report provided a comprehensive outline of the work required to restore the building. The work involved was divided into 2 phases. Phase 1, now largely complete, consisted of the emergency work necessary to stabilize and preserve the building. Phase 2, which will begin once the necessary funding is in place, will include all of the remaining work outlined in the conditions assessment. The money to carry out all this work to date has been provided by grants. 2 generous grants from the Ayer Community Preservation Committee funded preparation of the conditions assessment and Phase 1. Tentatively, funding for Phase 2 will also come from the Ayer Community Preservation Committee, with a possible matching grant from 1 or more other sources. If all goes well, the funding required for completing the restoration of Sandy Pond Schoolhouse will be in place in 2023. That Sandy Pond School is still with us today, over 150 years after it was built and 120 years since the last students left the building, is a small miracle. Across north-central Massachusetts, only a handful of other similar buildings still stand, and even fewer retain their original appearance. Here in Ayer, Sandy Pond School stands alone, a sole survivor of the single-room school era. Upon completion of the restoration work, Ayer's iconic little schoolhouse will reopen to the public, ready for its next 150 years. This little building, which once echoed with the sounds of student voices and later provided a venue for many different community events, is a vital part of Ayer history. Both an historic site and a community center, this beloved building has helped shape Ayer's cultural heritage, and will continue to do so for years to come.